you couldn't possibly have a conference on social equality in South Africa without talking about race. So I'm glad to be fulfilling that role. Okay, so Miranda had led off her talk yesterday by saying it's more illuminating to start with the non-ideal than the ideal. And I very much endorse this view. It's not merely a matter of getting the facts right, which are so often either obfuscated, ignored, or outright misrepresented, especially in philosophy, a discipline which tends to sort of conceive of itself in a very abstract way. So the facts don't really matter that much. But also, from a normative point of view, what is normatively required, what is sort of morally desirable, is also going to be dependent on the facts. And part of the problem that I and many others, people work on race, but not just people work on race, many feminist theorists, and I've learned a lot from feminist theory. The frustration that people experience with philosophy is a kind of idealizing, in the famous analysis of Honora O'Neill, an abstraction that is not an innocent abstraction, but a sort of pattern of abstraction that idealizes away from facts of social oppression, whether gender oppression, racial oppression, or whatever. So George, in the philosophy of leaving no tree unfelled, I'm an old-fashioned guy, I have a handout, and George, I'm now going to ask George, maybe he can get some assistance from the audience to distribute said handout. And there 100 were made. I hope that will be enough. People can always share. So I thought that the appropriate thing to begin in a talk on racial equality is with the history, not the history, the whole history of course, but a brief overview of race and racism, since obviously it's against the background of race and racism that racial equality becomes a goal, becomes an ideal. Okay, so racism as a term is used both ideationally and socio-institutionally. So the ideational sense, racism as a set of ideas, values, beliefs, and then the socio-institutional sense, social institutions and practices, and you can imagine subdividing that into sort of individual transactions, individual racist acts, group racist acts, and then institutional racism, which was a subject of discussion yesterday. So within philosophy, starting off with the first sense, analysis of racism are contested. So one major division is that between doxastic analyses of racism, which are focusing on belief, which see belief as maybe not just necessary and sufficient, but necessary and sufficient, and volitional, affective accounts, most famously defended by Jorge Garcia in a sort of important set of articles, which sees racism in terms of ill will, either racial hatred or racial disregard. So I'm going to assume throughout, without argument, that doxastic accounts are superior. And for those interested in the sort of literature, Thomas Shelby, Lawrence Blum, myself, various people have sort of critiques of Garcia along these lines and would argue that the doxastic account is ultimately a superior one. So at its very simplest then, we can think of racism in this first sense as the human race is divided into certain discrete races, and you had tremendous variation historically. This was part of the argument that some people used to sort of raise questions about racial theory, that some people said there are 3 to 4 basic races, some people had 60 or 70, so the very fact that there was so much variation in what was presumably a fundamental theoretical term should have sort of been a kind of warning sign. So these discrete races, and then some races are superior to others. So I'll just sort of say the R1s are the sort of top dog race number 1, then they're the low races. And then racism, in second sense, social institutions and practices that unfairly advantage some races at the expense of others. Okay, so what are the metrics of superiority? Well, there's been a whole range. There are the intellectual / cognitive, there are the characterological, there are the aesthetic, and there are the physical. But historically, the 2 most important ones have been the top 2, in the sense that the superior race has been seen as both smarter and of superior moral character. This becomes a bit complicated in some cases. With all these things, there are exceptions. For example, some varieties of anti-Semitism, arguably, do credit Jews with a certain kind of intelligence, even a superior intelligence, but it's a sinister intelligence. So you get a sort of combination there, not of intellectual inferiority, but sort of intellectual equality or superiority even, but sort of directed towards sinister ends. The aesthetic, you might think, where does that come from? But historically, that has been important. There was a German racist theorist, well-known guy, Christian Meiners, and his basic categorization was between beautiful and ugly races. Physical, that becomes more problematic from a racist point of view, in part because, there's a danger of the inferior race, so-called, then sort of, outperforming the superior race. The classic example here is in the Berlin Olympics, the 1936 Hitler Olympics, where Hitler's idea was that the superiority of the Aryan race was going to be sort of manifested in basically, the German team, trashing everybody else. And sort of one of those famous sort of intersections of sport and politics with the black American sprinter Jesse Owens wins 4 gold medals. And the story, I'm not sure if it's apocryphal or not, is that Hitler refuses to shake his hand, when the medals are being given out, because of course, where's your Aryan superiority then? But the problem with using physical criteria is not just that, but that you then get into a situation where you have a sort of rise in the sort of 40s, 50s post-war period of the great black athlete. So you then get a situation where races sort of concede the physical to so blacks in particular, but this ceases then to be a sign of superiority. Rather, it's a manifestation of the sort of greater closeness of blacks to the animal kingdom. So that's why I say the top two are the most important ones. Okay, then in terms of varieties of racism, now there's what the sort of underlying theory is. There's a sort of classic distinction, sort of theological racism, cultural racism, and biological racism, not necessarily mutually exclusive, insofar as you can imagine some supernatural entity creates a superior race, and it's also biologically superior, and it's sort of culturally superior. But obviously you can have them sort of, without those components. Okay, and then explanations of racism, because of course, in the present period, this is the sort of, main problem, how do you understand this, how do you get rid of it? And there's a wide range of theories that have been advanced. There's innate human ethnocentrism. So the idea is that we're all ethnocentric, and then racism sort of takes this sort of, one step up. So you sort of, racialize ethnocentricity, and you then get racism. There's innate cognitive psychology, and people who work on the implicit bias stuff know that there's a sort of lot of work being done on these days, with it's seemingly somewhat pessimistic implications, as far as it seems to suggest that there really is this tendency that you can sort of market in kids to sort of develop these categories, and that then forms the basis for racism. Historical European color symbolism has been one very popular candidate put forward for white racism. And people point out that if you go to one of those big dictionaries, not the small, but like a big sort of huge Oxford dictionary and look up, say, white, you get this sort of incredible list of synonyms, sort of, purity, virtue, innocence, light, and all this good stuff. And then blackness has these negative connotations. So you then get this theory on the part of some theorists of race. European, quote-unquote, explorers go out into the world, say in West Africa, they encounter dark people, so they then project onto the black body all the vices that are sort of already associated with this color. There are explanations in terms of religion and culture. There's psychosexual explanations, sort of, linked up with the idea of the dark body and the dark parts on the white body. There's all kinds of weird stuff out there believing. There's, of course, sociobiology, which claims to be able to sort of explain everything and therefore can explain racism as well. There's rational choice, power politics stuff. And, of course, for those people on the left, sort of diminishing number, they're good old explanations in terms of political economy. You talk about the political economy, of capitalism, political economy, imperialism, and so forth. So there's a sort of wide range of explanations. And, of course, one of the implications of that is that the remedial prescriptions that follow are then going to vary significantly. So, for example, if you have a sort of classic Marxist view that sort of links racism with capitalism, you're going to be dubious that's going to be possible to sort of get rid of racism within a capitalist framework. So, you then sort of say, well, you can only sort of get rid of this by sort of linking the anti-racist struggle to the socialist struggle. Other people who don't buy that kind of analysis would say, well, no, capitalism historically may have had some kind of role in sort of developing racism, but it doesn't necessarily follow that, you cannot sort of get an anti-racist capitalist system. So you then get fierce debates. And for example, over the 20th century, when the left was more active and live than it is now, you'd get debates between those who had sort of straight class analysis, those who had more sort of race analysis, what's the best way to struggle against racism. Okay, there are also issues about periodization. So many scholars, this has been sort of conventional wisdom for some time after World War II, that race and racism only come into existence in modernity. But there's always been a dissenting minority that sort of say that's wrong, and that you can in fact, find racism and race in antiquity. And the case of the dissenters has been strengthened sort of 10 years ago by the publication of this huge book, Benjamin Isaac, an Israeli classicist, The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity. Sort of going back to the source and saying, you sort of look at what these guys are saying in the ancient Greece of 5th century BCE, and what you are in fact finding are racist views. And he in fact identifies Aristotle within the Western tradition as a pioneering racist theorist, that we sort of see Aristotle as sort of a sort of crucial figure in initiating ideas that are then sort of developed. He originally used the term proto-racism, but in later work he argues that this term has led to sort of misunderstandings. He didn't mean it was not racism, but an early form of racism, so he now wants to drop the proto. And there's a subsequent conference with Isaac and like-minded folks, and they produce an anthology, The Origins of Racism in the West, and that's the overall analysis, that you have to sort of go back all the way to ancient Greece. And these views that sort of position racism as modern and linked to European imperialism, they're just wrong. So it's a sort of flat out, sort of contrarian account that you really have to sort of look at this at the sort of very start of the Western tradition. And ironically, they themselves have been accused of racism, because part of their argument is, if you look at the classical civilizations of the period around the Mediterranean, you don't find racism not because of the sort of innate virtues of these other civilizations, but they had not achieved the level of sort of abstract thought for their views to count as racist. So in other words, their claim is that racism presupposes a certain level of sort of conceptual hierarchy and abstraction, and it's only in ancient Greece that you find that sort of level of development of thought. So even in its malfeasance, so to speak, the West is superior, ironically enough. Anyway, so there are those views, and there are other people who say that's just wrong, and you can find racist views in ancient China, in ancient India, and so forth. Anyway, so the conventional view, as I say, for most scholars has been race and racism products of modernity. And George Fredrickson, who's one of the main sources I'm going to use for this paper, he has this very useful book, Racism: A Short History, and he says you find racism at its earliest in the late medieval period, but it's basically a product of modernity. So that gives you the following periodization that I have on the table. Ancient medieval period, this is pre-racist. You then get racism in the modern period, and then in terms of the dominant variety of racism, leading up to sort of start of the 19th century, it's basically cultural and theological. Late 18th century, with Kant and Blumenbach, you then get the birth of modern scientific racism, biological racism. That's sort of dominant for a century and a half, and then after World War II, that's discredited by the Holocaust. And that you then get a shift to what many theorists say is the sort of dominant variety of racism today, cultural racism. So if you think of a sort of periodization of sort of in the past few decades, then pre-World War II period, racist theories of race are predominant, and you have the view that race are conceptualized as subsections of the human race in these hierarchical relations along axes primarily, as I say, of the intellectual and characterological superiority, and whites see themselves global as a superior race. So part of what I'm trying to do in this paper is put South Africa in a global context. The idea is that this is not an isolated issue, this is not just a problem of this country. Even apartheid, South Africa was an extreme example. There's a global problem of race linked with the history of European imperialism and colonialism. So whites see themselves as a global superior race ruling inferior races in the European colonial empires and in the Anglo and Iberian Euro-settler states. And it's important to emphasize, especially for contemporary students who often sort of think that, it's basically, a few sort of, bad folks here and there. These views are not aberrant, these views are the norm. Racism is a white common sense of the age. Okay, so post-World War II, as I say, racism is discredited, or at least biological racism, by Nazism. And there's a famous line that Fredrickson quotes, Hitler gives racism a bad name. So the idea is you're bringing the mass killings home, you sort of having the death camps on European soil, you're killing fellow Europeans, even if they're Jews. I mean, what is this? This is crazy. It's not like you're killing Africans or Asians or Native Americans. Okay, but as I say, there are many people who argue that racism does not vanish, unfortunately, but that you now get a new variety of racism becoming dominant. Okay, so now that you have a situation where anti-racism is now at least officially the norm, race and racism themselves become the topic of inquiry. So theories of race, which would previously have just been straightforwardly racist theories, now become theories of how race works. Okay, so if races are all equal, if in fact you get a scientific consensus after World War II in biology and anthropology that races don't really exist, then what's going on? What explains this sort of entry of race into the world? What explains the dynamics of racism? So theories of race now mean something quite different. It means theories of trying to understand in a descriptive way how race works, and for philosophers in particular, what are the normative implications of this stuff. Okay, so Fredrickson suggests we can demarcate, and this is racism too, going back to the original distinction, overtly racist regimes, so that's the US South under Jim Crow, Nazi Germany, apartheid South Africa, from what he calls racialized societies. And that's the US North, that's Latin America, that's the colonial world. So the key point to notice is that even though overtly racist regimes are separated, the idea that race is running through a whole bunch of societies, that is basically saying that most of the globe is affected by racialization, either overt and crude or in this more subtle form. And these categories are coarse. We'd obviously need further categories in the US, for example, to demarcate between, let's say, the period 1930s, 1940s, 50s of Jim Crow, the civil rights revolutions of the 50s and 60s, and what we're now seeing as a sort of post-civil rights epoch, or in the colonial world, from the colonial period to the post-colonial period. And of course, the question is it really post-colonial? Is it neo-colonial? Does it still need decolonizing? Okay, so current South Africa, then, as I don't have to tell you guys, you live here, right, would then be seen as having shifted into the second category. No longer an overtly racist society, but a racialized society. And the cognitive virtue, in a perverse sense, of an overtly racist society is that, at least if you're sort of any kind of humanist anti-racist, its wrongness is self-evident. You don't have to be a bleeding heart liberal. You can say, this is just wrong. But a racialized society, that's significantly different. And for many people in a racialized society, racism is past. What's the problem? What are you guys still bitching about? Okay, and as in the United States, I can tell you there are many whites who feel exactly that. And I'm sure that in South Africa, there are many people who feel the same way. So the question then is, and this segues into part 2 of the paper, how should we think of racial equality under these circumstances? So there are two terms, there's racial and there's equality. Okay, so I just said that the scientific consensus of many people, though it's begun to there's begun to be a sort of backlash the other way, has been that it turns out races could not be in a hierarchy in the first place because races didn't exist. There are no biological races to be in a hierarchy, so there's a sense in which you use old-fashioned language as a category mistake. Okay, so if you have that sort of scientific view becoming sort of more and more prevalent, then why are you still using the term race? This term race is appropriate for a period when you had this conception that there were really these natural subsections of the human race. We're now past that. Why are you guys still hanging on to race? So there's been this debate in philosophy among those who work on race over the past few decades over what the appropriate sort of metaphysics of race is. And they're basically, this is somewhat simplified because it's become far more complex. You start off with sort of 3 basic positions, you then mod it with a 4th, and they've been sort of subsequent development. So this is just sort of in essentials. So position number 1, eliminativism. Races don't exist, we should get rid of the term from our vocabulary. Races don't exist in any sense. Anti-eliminativism, and that subdivides into biological races do exist, but not in a hierarchy. So the old racist view was wrong, but it is nonetheless true that race exists. The dominant position among people who work on race in philosophy is position number 2, constructivism. Races exist not biologically, but as socio-political constructs. And then there's a kind of hybrid position that people like Philip Kitcher at Columbia and Robin Anderson hold, that actually you guys are both wrong. Races exist both biologically and socio-politically. Okay, so you can see the sort of complications. Anyway, so for the dominant constructivist view, what it then means is that insofar as there's cognitive or characterological variation among people, it's an artifact of these social processes. So you then get a whole different vocabulary in which people talking about racing and racializing, because this then becomes a verb. So rather than these sort of static natural entities, you then have social processes which are mutable, which are variable, and people's race can change. It can change if you move from one country to another. It can change over time, and you get a whole sort of different way of looking at race. But as I say, it's complicated because there's recent discoveries in epigenetics, and this is not my area at all, but the idea is that genes can apparently be turned on and off by certain environmental stimuli. So you can get a situation where social oppression can actually lead to genetic change. So that the sort of old straightforward dichotomy, environmentalism versus hereditarianism, it turns out that could be overly simple in that a sort of negative environment could then sort of spark genetic change. So that in a weird sense, Lamarck, who was in sort of competition with Darwin, a kind of Lamarckian view could sort of, long after the fact, be partially vindicated. Okay, so there are further complications and variations, which I look at the clock, and I think I probably shouldn't go through, in that, eliminativism and anti-eliminativism are going to come in different versions, depending on your theory of society. So you can say socially constructed, but what is your view of social dynamics? If you think of the view of society that a liberal would have, a Marxist, a Unitarian, a post-structuralist, you can obviously get sort of very different building blocks for construction. Okay, so let's now work with a liberal framework and pay credit here, and she's in the audience, so I can't steal her idea. I knew she was coming to the conference, so I decided I better sort of make sure I give her credit. Ann Codd's Analyzing Oppression, a book I highly recommend to everybody. And one of the key things that Ann does in this book is says that we need to rethink liberalism as a political philosophy, and one of the things we need to do is to revise its social ontology. Because the usual way liberalism has developed is that classically, if you go back to sort of early contract theory, it's these atomic individuals, or even the case of Locke, they're somewhat social individuals. It's not a situation where the ontology of liberalism includes a sort of, central reference points, non-voluntary social groups. Social groups are basically associations, things you join. And what Anne wants to say, and I very much agree, you need a liberal ontology that can accommodate groups and relations of domination and subordination, genders, classes, and races. Because with the exception of passing, it's not the case that you choose your race. It's not the case that you can say, this black thing, I've done it for a while, now I think I'm going to move on, I'm going to white guy. You don't really have that option. Okay, so non-voluntary social groups. Okay, so here are some ways of looking at racial equality: ontological, capability, and social. So when I say ontological, I'm suggesting this sort of key sense of inequality and equality. Because you have a history of several hundred years of people being depicted as unequal, then the sort of crucial idea is basically that by virtue of your being an R2, R3, etc., you're an inferior being. That's why I call it ontological. So there's some threshold for equal moral treatment, and because of the particular characteristics you have, you don't make that threshold. And it then follows that in a huge amount of the literature, from the anti-racist tradition, from the anti-colonial tradition, right here in South Africa, from sort of black tradition, has been the affirmation of one's equal personhood. And of course, analytic philosophy is the best place to explore that. You have to look at the phenomenological tradition, the existential tradition. You have to look at Du Bois, Biko, Fanon, and this idea that I am seen as an unequal, I am an equal, I have to affirm my equality, my equal personhood in a society so structured as to deny it. So the ontological stuff is really sort of really crucial. So that part is relatively uncontroversial in the sense that everybody today who has sort of any sort of minimal commitments to anti-racism is going to say, yes, we're all ontologically equal. So that's no longer controversial. The controversial stuff then is sort of, then turns out in, how is this cashed out in these other areas? Okay, so think of capability. Now, Anthony Appiah has a famous discussion where he says racism can be demarcated into extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic racism, the racist says you're morally inferior by virtue of these particular traits you have. And that's a sort of straightforward sense you dealt with that first. But he also has a notion of intrinsic racism where the racist thinks you're a member of an inferior race and it doesn't matter what your traits are. There's something just in you. So you could also even question whether this is really a sort of coherent view, sort of people to have psychological. But anyway, the extrinsic sense of racism, you don't make the threshold, you don't count as an equal person because of the particular traits you have that lower you below that threshold. So it then raises the following interesting question in terms of how you define racism. Suppose somebody says, I do think blacks are inferior, but I'm not a racist. Because a racist is somebody who thinks you shouldn't treat blacks as equal persons. So I think blacks are inferior on these sort of crucial metrics of, say, intelligence and character, but they're not that much inferior that they fall below the threshold. And some of the discussions of scientific racism in the US, you often find people in the scientific racist category being genuinely, it would seem, sort of shocked that people think of themselves as racist. Because, look, I'm just saying what the facts are. Blacks don't perform as well, they're inferior. But of course, we should treat blacks as persons. They're not as smart as we are, but they're still persons. So then there's a question of how do you define racism? Do you define it in terms of falling below the threshold, or do you just say any claim of intrinsic biological variation in these traits counts as racism? Okay, then there's a distinction between potential capabilities that people have and actual capabilities in terms of the realization of them. So again, to reference US experience, there's a long history of a difference between black and white IQ scores. And there are all kinds of straightforwardly non-racist explanations for this. For example, the tests are culturally biased. It's not the case that black households have the same degree of wealth and the same degree of preparation of students. But there's also the claim of some conservatives, it's basically black culture. So there's an oppositional black culture in the ghetto. There's the idea that acting white, that means studying and so has to be stigmatized. So in that respect, you need to understand it's the fault of these blacks. So then you get question in terms of definition. Does that count as cultural racism, or for the people sort of advancing these views, does this just count as an alternative explanation which should not be seen as racist? So there are all kinds of complications in terms of once you move away from sort of straightforward biological racism, cultural racism is a much more nebulous category, and there's a sort of big fights about what should be counted as cultural racism, and for conservatives, what should just count as you're not facing the facts about the real source of black problems. Okay, for our purposes, social equality purposes, then of course what we want to look at is racial social equality in terms of the sort of overall macro indicators. So you look at sort of legal, political, and economic. Okay, so you're evolving from an overtly racist regime, Jim Crow in the United States, apartheid in South Africa. You're supposed to be evolving towards a non-racist society, and the idea is that the ontological equality of all South Africans, which is now officially affirmed, it's there in the Constitution, it's there in, I'm sure, every speech people make. How does this ontological equality translate into these sociological variables? In other words, legal, political, economic. You've gotten rid of apartheid, you've gotten rid of restrictions on the vote. What does equality now mean? Okay, equality before the law, good liberal principle, but what about corrective legislation to remedy the legacy of the past? What about equal resources to hire a good lawyer? And this isn't, of course, race alone, this is class as well. What about a facially, it's a term that lawyers, a facially race-neutral criminal justice system that in effect targets particular races? And I don't know what the stats are here in South Africa, but there's a book in the US, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, got a lot of attention because she's pointing about the extent to which the sort of hugely disproportionate number of blacks and Latinos in the US prison system basically undermines the sort of pretensions to legal equality. And she sees it as basically a new manifestation of the system that one thought had been transcended. The right to vote and run for office. We saw those long, impressive lines of people lined up in townships. But the question is the structure of representative democracy that you now have such as that it's genuinely responsible to everybody's needs? Or I was just reading Lawrence Hamilton's book, perhaps some of you have read it, Are South Africans Free? Or is it the case that the system functions in such a way that it's really not responsive? And then, of course, the final and obvious one, you now have the equal right to enter the market, you can apply for all jobs, but is it going to be the case that formal equality of opportunity is going to be able to undermine the huge inequalities in degrees of preparedness, educational access, family wealth, and so forth? So there's a basic problem, which is that systemic racial inequality established over several hundred years will not merely be deeply entrenched, but it's going to interact with these different spheres having synergistic effects, sort of locking in place, not to sort of undo the system, but unfortunately to sort of help to perpetuate the system. And the history of the US sort of manifests this quite clearly. So in terms of US key piece of legislation, so after the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, you have Reconstruction. Then you have what is traditionally seen as the betrayal of Reconstruction, the withdrawal of federal troops, blacks then being sort of turned over to the mercy of their former owners, so that in the 1950s and 60s, these crucial decisions, the Brown Supreme Court decision, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, these are seen by many people as the second Reconstruction. First one didn't work, but guys, we're finally on the page now. We've got it. Well, alas, no. So 60 years after the Brown decision, in many parts of the country, schools are more segregated than they were then. So the high point of educational desegregation was the 70s and 80s. Since then, there's a phenomenon of resegregation. In residential segregation, in large cities with large minority population, or in some cases majority populations, if you look at Chicago, for example, or many California cities, segregation has started to change. Employment discrimination in terms of loans for housing, that's still a sort of marked by patterns of discrimination, which is sort of repeatedly documented by sending out testers, people with the same credentials, same credit rating, and there's systematically the case that blacks and Latinos are denied with the same credentials on the basis that whites get loans for. So what had been seen as landmarks that will usher in this new post-racial era have unfortunately proved disappointing in practice. And the culminating process, of course, for many white Americans, the election of a black president, the final proof that racial justice had been achieved, has taken place simultaneous with the gap, the median wealth gap between white and Latino and white and black households achieving its highest level since the government started collecting data on it. So the figure became, I think it's in 2010, it's 20 to 1 and 18 to 1, white to black and white to Latino. And that was before the figures from the subprime mortgage crisis came in. And there are some people who say that the subprime mortgage meltdown represents the largest transfer of wealth out of the hands of people of color in US history. And this is taking place under black president. So the point to emphasize is that while nobody can underestimate the sort of huge symbolic value of Obama's election, and we all know how many op-eds and articles and doubtless dissertations were written on that, it's not necessarily going to change things in terms of the substantive conditions of people unless the system of self-reproducing racial advantage and disadvantage is dismantled. So that's what we really have to focus on. So that some people in the civil rights community are now calling for a third Reconstruction. Maybe in a third time will be the charm. First time, no. Second time, well, third time, guys. But unfortunately, it's happening at a time when for many whites, as I say, Obama's election is proof that racial justice has been achieved. And there's this really startling poll taken 2 years ago, asked white Americans, which is the race that you think is most likely to be discriminated against? And by a large majority, the consensus was it's white people. We are the ones who are most likely to be subject to discrimination. So these are not exactly salubrious times, the sort of demanding measures for racial. As I said earlier, what are you guys still bitching about? Okay, so you can affirm ontological racial equality, you can do your philosophical thing and say we're all equal as Kantian persons, and it's not necessarily going to make that much difference in terms of these everyday practices, which are then going to sort of have feedback effects, so that even if you're equal in theory, are you going to be equal in actuality, and is the sort of inequalities across these different spheres not going to have a negative effect on the extent to which you do see yourself as a full person? Okay, so that then brings us to liberalism. So we're going to assume we're working with a liberal normative framework. Now, racial equality in the individual sense for liberalism should be straightforward. Why? Because as we all know, the theory's starting point is in isolated individuals. Colorless individuals, raceless individuals, therefore why can't people of color be subsumed under those individual categories? And the reality is sort of parallel sort of work that, parallel to the work that second wave feminist theorists did in terms of showing the maleness of these individuals for Locke and Hobbes and so forth. It's also the case that there's evidence for the whiteness of these individuals. And for me, one of the most sort of startling manifestations of this is that the ethicist, normally seen as the most important moral theorist of the modern period, that's Immanuel Kant, is now being viewed by some philosophers as the father of modern scientific racism. So he has the moral and political writings, but he also has anthropological and physical geography writings. And some people say if you look at the sort of detailed analysis he gives there, it's sort of sufficiently sophisticated and detailed that you can sort of give him the dishonor. This is sort of most detailed early statement of scientific racism. So you have a liberalism that basically has a color line running through it. So freedom and equality for white male individuals, for other individuals, well, you guys really aren't that individual. And there's this great book by an Italian philosopher, Domenico Losordo, that's been translated and published by Verso, Liberalism and Counter History, which goes into all this stuff that you're not going to find in standard histories of liberalism taught in political philosophy and political theory courses. The extent to which liberalism, this ideology of universalism and inclusion, is basically complicit not just with racism, not just with sexism, but even white working class male subordination. Now, if you think about the extent to which many of the things that we think of as sort of, definitive of modernity, that even the white European male working class doesn't sort of, get these rights. And we think of property restrictions on suffrage, for example. And that liberalism and sort of leading liberals, the people we see as the sort of, luminaries of the sort of New Enlightenment ideology, for the most part, with some, honorable exceptions complicit with it. So what's the point? The point is not muckraking. The point is not sort of, gotcha. The point is to say that liberalism as an ideology has basically been structured through and through by exclusions. And what it then means is that if we're to work within a liberal framework, we need to be sort of able to self-consciously identify these exclusions so that we can then correct for them and then say, given this history, here's what a liberalism would need to look like. And the example I've followed here has been very much second wave feminist liberal theory, because that was a strategy they took. They said you get a liberalism that's basically a patriarchal theory. So it's a patriarchal liberal theory, and it's systemically shaped by male domination. It's not accidental, it's not contingent. The idea is if you want to privilege males, you have to develop the apparatus in this way. So, it's not merely a question of sort of stigmatizing women as sort of lesser than men, but it means that, the way you map the territory, the public-private distinction, you're going to draw it in such a way that justice is over here, this stuff is, this is a private sphere, justice doesn't enter into this, and you then get a liberalism which serves male interests and which does not seem gender biased, because that's just how it is. That's where women are, that's where the public sphere is. And I don't have to tell you, there's sort of huge amount of work on this for the past 4 decades, since the sort of second wave entry of women into philosophy and political theory. My suggestion is, and what I'm trying to do in my own work, is basically run a parallel argument for race, and to argue that in the same way that we see liberalism as patriarchal, we should see it as also racial. And I'm drawing here, there are comparatively fewer people in philosophy working on these issues, but there's an increasing body of work in political science. For example, there's a woman whose book some of you may have read, Jennifer Pitts, Political Science, University of Chicago, and Jennifer's book is A Turn to Empire, The Rise of Imperial Liberalism in Britain and France. So the argument is that liberalism originally is not that bad. You can find anti-racist, anti-imperialist elements in it, but with the sort of growth of European empires, liberalism then they're sort of become complicit with empire. So John Stuart Mill, the beloved John Stuart Mill of On Liberty and so forth, he says, as you all know, in that sort of famous paragraph in On Liberty, that these principles of non-interference, these sort of anti-paternalist principles, they're basically not meant for those in their knowledge, those races in their knowledge, those races which sort of don't make the cut. So the idea is that Mill is a liberal, and he's anti-slavery, give him credit, but he's an employee of the British East India Company. He's a colonial theorist. Locke, as we all know, had investments in the slave trade. Hegel is a sort of theorist of colonialism, so that you get liberal theory developing as an imperial liberal theory, and that's going to mean pretty well a racial liberal theory. So my suggestion is then that in the same way that feminists then sort of interrogate liberal categories and say, are these categories sort of natural organic outgrowths of what liberalism should be as an ideology centered on the flourishing of individuals, or are these categories shaped by male domination in pernicious ways? I'm arguing we sort of run a parallel exercise in terms of race. So you have a patriarchal liberal theory, and feminist liberals say, here's how we sort of make it anti-sexist. And you have a racial liberal theory, and then I'm saying we need to de-imperialize it, or we need to sort of make it anti-racist, and here's how one would do it. Okay, so from that perspective then, we look at liberalism as it actually exists, and we ask ourselves, given what was pointed out in the opening pages about the prevalence of racialized social systems around the world, given the fact that liberalism is supposed to be committed to the flourishing of the individual, then why is it the case that racial inequalities have not been the subject of more attention in liberal political philosophy? Why is it the case that racialized social systems have not been an object of theoretical inquiry and theoretical condemnation? So there's a large literature out there within liberal tradition. This is a racialized social system. These characterized in large parts of the world. These are bad. This is what we need to do to move beyond them. And Anne suggests, well, there's a broad pattern Anne suggests of the complicity of philosophy with social privilege. And in her preface, she has this really startling claim, and I thought, my God, think about that, when she says, hers is the first book in the analytic tradition to be dedicated to the subject of analyzing oppression. Now let's think about that for a moment. This is philosophy, supposed to be concerned about justice and truth, and this is the first book in the analytic tradition to focus on oppression, which sort of affects, obviously, both justice and truth. So there's a sort of general problem of social privilege, manifest in sort of complicity with sexism, and there's a particular problem in terms of race, because at least you now have a 20% female demographic population, where in the case of race in the US, it's 98%, and that's a garden of diversity as compared to Britain, not pick on Joe here, it's not your fault, you're doing the right thing, where it's like 100%, England, Europe. I think there's one black German philosopher identified himself to me, and it's sort of bad elsewhere. So it's really and truly a very long way to go. So the sort of general bias in the profession, the sort of complicity with privilege, is exacerbated in the case of race. Okay, so you have this literature which sort of is stimulated by John Rawls's work, and political philosophy. For many people, Rawls is like the sort of Jesus of the profession. He brings it back, arise, political philosophy, rise and walk. He brings it back from the dead, and you say, well, okay, this is great, because Rawls is saying, never mind that political obligation stuff, been there, done that, let's focus on really important stuff, social justice. And in those sort of precious sentences at the opening of a theory of justice, he says, we know that matters of injustice are the pressing and urgent matters. Well, this is great, so we're going to sort of get some action on this. 40 years later, still waiting. Now, how did that happen? Well, unfortunately, what Rawls says is that to do non-ideal theory, which is in a social justice, we need to do ideal theory, which is social justice. And once we've done ideal theory, we'll then be conceptually equipped to move on to non-ideal theory. And the problem is that 40 years later, sort of wandering the desert, we're still waiting. So my thought is that what we need to do is we need to rethink liberal justice theory in a fairly radical way. So Rawls says you start off by looking at a well-ordered society as a perfectly just society, and then you get all the crucial conceptual distinctions and normative recommendations, and then someday you then move on to non-ideal theory. My thought is, sort of picking up with what I said about how Miranda opened her talk, you start off by looking at an ill-ordered society, and God knows there's no shortage of them. So you start off with an ill-ordered society and then look at the particular ways in which it's ill-ordered. It doesn't mean you're abandoning normativity. It means that you're taking normativity within a different conceptual framework. In part because a well-ordered society, I would claim, is not really attainable once you've had serious injustices, because those injustices leave a sort of stain such that you can't ever sort of get back this sort of in a pristine, sort of well-ordered ideal. Okay, so what you do is this. You would start off non-ideal theory, and in the case of race, though you could apply it to gender also, you're going to look not at distributive justice, but rectificatory justice. And one of the sort of startling things about the social justice literature in the Anglo-American analytic tradition is the extent to which rectificatory justice has just vanished. Rectificatory justice is precisely the correction of injustices. If you were to ask a lay person what social justice is about, they would give you an answer in terms of whether these are unjust and you correct them. It's one of the most remarkable features of the Rawlsian literature, and those of us who have been socialized by it, that we don't perceive any absurdity about this, an entire huge body of literature in which a sort of lay sense of correcting injustices is almost never discussed. Was just sort of all there in the sort of ideal theory world, and there's a promise that one day we'll move out of it, and that promise has yet to be fulfilled. Now, the virtue of taking rectificatory justice as a sort of crucial point is, I would claim, this. Liberalism, as we know, is not a monolith, it's divided between left and right wings. Rawls, a social democratic liberal theory which had great influence in the academy, but alas, had far less influence in the real world. So that in a sense, Nozickian, market, neo-liberal theory basically became hegemonic. As we know, the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions from the 1980s. So Rawls may have won the battle in the academy. You could say in a sense that Nozick won the battle in the real world. Contemporary South Africa, as you know, is not exactly sort of going faster and forward on the social democratic path. The virtue of rectificatory justice, I would claim, is that in theory at least, you could say practice is different, but in theory at least, there's somewhat of a convergence between the liberalism of the left and the right, in that a principled, anti-racist, right-wing liberal is supposed to be committed to correcting past injustices. And I'm assuming that Nozick's Anarchist State and Utopia is still the best statement of the right-wing liberal position. And Nozick, to give him credit, explicitly makes rectificatory justice part of his theory of justice, and also has a brief discussion of race, brief footnote. He says, well, he doesn't have any sophisticated treatment of these issues, but see Boris Bitko's book. Okay, so Rawls as a social democrat is committed to substantive egalitarianism, sort of material egalitarianism as a goal. And there's a huge body of literature, some more critical, sort of further left than Rawls, but egalitarianism for such folks means basically egalitarianism of this material kind, whether it's going to be in terms of resources or welfare or and so forth. But there's also egalitarianism in a weaker sense. That sense that goes back to the liberal revolutions, that goes back to the somewhat hedged Glorious Revolution, American and French revolutions, the simple proclamation of the moral, juridical, political equality of individuals. And my claim would be that once you sort of take these seemingly weak liberal principles and put them in conjunction with the real life history of race, where people of inferior races were not seen as equals, you can then get surprisingly radical conclusions. In other words, you don't have to rely on left liberal assumptions. You can just say, you guys were not living up to your right-wing liberal principles of treating all people as equals. And it then meant that you created a society, you created an economy which was systematically structured on an anti-liberal basis, if you consider liberalism in its ideal, deracialized sense. So you then go and say to the political right, okay guys, we can fight about what a perfect just society would look like, but at least we should be able to get together on the idea that there have been serious racial injustices in the past, they need correction, they're in violation of the principles that you claim to adhere to, therefore you should be able to sort of get together with us on this at least. We can fight, we can then have a subsequent fight in terms of whether the society should be a social democracy or a market society, but at least we should all be able to agree on the correction of injustices of the past. And what you would then do, you're not appealing to fair equality of opportunity, you're not appealing to the difference principle, which are sort of controversial, left liberal assumptions. You're saying that the condition of, in this society, let's say, of blacks, of other people of color, is a result of social oppression by uncontroversial liberal standards across the spectrum. Not by left liberal standards, but in theory by right liberal standards, insofar as the condition of blacks is not the result of market competition and losing out in fair market competition. Rather, to use the late Charles Tilly's phrase, it's opportunity hoarding on the part of whites. So it's basically a situation where it's not that people basically have sort of equal access to opportunities, but there's a kind of monopoly of opportunities by whites, and they're sort of shared among whites, and people of color are sort of deprived of a chance of them. And this is supposed to be inconsistent with liberal market norms. And the crucial book here, of course, is Elizabeth Anderson's important book, The Imperative of Integration, massively documented with the social science facts and figures to show the extent to which segregation in the US has systematically disadvantaged blacks. Okay, so that's theory. Now, what's reality? And of course, even for a philosopher, you have to come back to reality, as I said at the start. The reality, alas, is that in a poll a few years ago, what do you think of the idea of reparations to blacks? No less than 96% of whites. So usually in polls you get a spread, 20%, 30. 96% of whites said, no way is this happening. So we're talking about corrective justice, rectificatory justice in the US with sort of that kind of atmosphere. I don't know what the situation here in South Africa, where apartheid is not as far away as Jim Crow is in the States, but that's one sort of set of obstacles that you have to contend with. So insofar as liberalism is going to be your vehicle for this normative appeal, what do you need to do? My claim would be that we need to rethink liberalism from the ground up and basically recognize that the dominant forms of liberalism of the modern epoch have been forms complicit with sexual and racial domination, and that a rethinking of liberalism is not merely going to mean that a sort of reconsideration of classic liberal values, freedom, equality, self-realization, and so forth, but a ground floor re-examination of the ontology. So here are some sort of brief suggestions. So as I said, shifting the focus of justice theory from ideal to non-ideal theory and to rectificatory and not solely distributive justice. Developing a revisionist liberal social ontology that allows for the existence of non-voluntary social groups. Reconceptualizing society as characterized by group domination. Rawls makes that famous statement, the opening pages of Theory of Justice, let's think of society as a sort of cooperative venture for mutual advantage, as an ideal, great, as a reality, somewhat deviant from actual history. You want to sort of get to the ideal, it's good to start off with the actual situation. Actual societies are not characterized by sort of cooperation for mutual advantage. They're characterized by group privilege of certain kinds. Liberal theory needs to take that into account. Individualism seen as a sort of major obstacle to these kinds of processes, but you need to demarcate moral individualism, seeing the individual as a locus of value, from descriptive individualism, which is sort of having the individual in a kind of vacuum, unaffected by society. So you keep moral individualism, that's attractive. You reject descriptive individualism and say individuals are positioned as members of social groups. And that's going to affect the possibility for them to realize their individuality. More informed socio-historical theorization. In other words, guys, this stuff is taking place in the actual world. The actual world has been characterized by all kinds of oppression. It's been characterized by this long history, not just in countries like South Africa and the US, but globally, of racial oppression that needs to be part of the liberal background story. Investigator emphasis on the reproduction of unfair group advantage. As I say, part of the problem in the US is if you focus explicitly on racism, conceptualized individually, and the idea is, I never owned any slaves, my family came here in the 1930s, long after this stuff was over, why are you picking on me? I'm a liberal, anti-racist white guy, see all my black friends. Well, that black friend anyway, over there. And the point you need to make to people is, whether you're racist or not, there's a system in place that advantages you, so that our focus needs to be not merely on racism as these discrete acts, but systemic unfair advantage and how that tends to go on. And then finally, it's going to mean an expansion of the sense of virtues. As we know, you can find virtues in philosophy going back to the ancient world. We need to sort of rethink our list of virtues to take account of individuals as part of structures, and the particular virtues and vices that the vices you're likely to develop, the virtues you need to cultivate if you're a member of a privileged group, in this case of a racial privileged group. Obviously those who are not racially privileged also need to cultivate virtues. It's not the case that they can just, hey, so I'm complete, I can do what I want. Everybody has sort of cultivate virtues, but there are going to be particular moral responsibilities on the racially privileged. So my claim would be that with such a liberalism, it's no guarantee of anything, but it gives us a better chance of tackling racial injustice and of working towards racial equality than the liberalism that we have now. Thank you.